I get a lot of questions about these men. And one of the questions I get is, why haven't you helped them more? Now, like I say, we did help them. We sent them lawyers who attended with them and were fired by them. And they've had their own lawyers. And frankly, they've never asked me for the lawyers since then. And I've spoken to two of their lawyers who are now former lawyers, and neither asked me for funds. And I understand there was other crowdfunding. But I think our approach to these men was a journalistic approach. That is, we covered the blockade while it was underway, and we've covered several of the preliminary hearings, and we will obviously cover the trial if it comes, although I get a feeling it's going to be plea bargained away. And there's a lot of people who sense a political veneer here. And after the dropping of the serious charges today, I think everyone's going to feel that. But when the charge was conspiracy to commit murder, that's simply outside the civil liberties scope of Rebel News. We defend hundreds of people across Canada, including dozens of truckers. In fact, we've crowdfunded for the Democracy Fund the legal defense of 3,000 different Canadians in almost every province. Many of them are truckers. Some of them are criminal offenses, but they're not serious criminal offenses. So when I was asked why we didn't show more financial support for the truckers, that's my answer. We raised the money from our donors for civil liberties cases, not just to do general criminal defense for serious cases. That said, it now appears that the level of the charge was a political act, that these four men were overcharged by police, that police were looking to make a public statement, just like their press kit, their photo did. I think that Chris Lysak and Jerry Morin, through their plea bargain, have made it impossible for themselves to sue the government because they have admitted, whether it was under some sort of pressure or not, they've admitted to have broken some laws under legal counsel. And I think their legal counsel said, look, this is the best deal you're going to get. And if you risk a trial, you theoretically could do 10 years in prison. But if the other two, Chris Carbert and Tony Olenek, if they go through the trial, if they fight the charges, and if they win, then I think they have a serious claim to look into what could be malicious prosecution. Because if the Crown prosecutor has dropped those heavy charges 2 years in against the two more aggressive suspects, and if they lose against the two remaining ones, I've got to think there's a lot of internal documents, perhaps that have been not disclosed, showing a political motivation here. And this was the fear of so many people from the beginning. I think that this whole thing has been absolutely terrible. I've met some of the mothers of these kids, including Tony Olenek's mom, who's a widow, and Tony is her only son. Imagine having your only son in prison for 2 years. There's no politics in those women. There's nothing but sorrow and pain for their kids. I hope that justice will be served. And I hope that these men did not do these terrible crimes. And the fact that the two harder edged ones have had those serious crimes dropped from over their heads suggests that maybe there's 2 more acquittals ahead. I should tell you that we are crowdfunding other men in Coutts who still have not had their trial. We are crowdfunding for the so-called Coutts 3, different from the Coutts 4. That's Marco van Hugenbos, Alex van Herk, and George Jansen. Now, those men are not in custody. They were charged with minor offenses, and they were let out. They're out on bail conditions. They're more like Tamara Leach, who Rebel News is crowdfunding for through the Democracy Fund. So we do help truckers, including truckers in Alberta, including truckers who are still facing criminal prosecution out of Coutts. We just made the decision not to defend serious violent crimes. And some people have disagreed with us on that, and that's their right to do so. It seems that the men, however, have had no shortage of crowdfunding to pay their legal bills if Tony Olenek was able to raise $550,000. I find this a terrible chapter in policing and in courts. We know the police were abusive. Our reporters caught police vandalizing farm equipment to disable it for fear that that farm equipment would actually be brought to the blockade. And the police admitted that incredibly. We saw that the police charged a Christian pastor, Arthur Pavlovsky, for simply giving a sermon to the men. And by the way, Rebel News is crowdfunding through the Democracy Fund his appeal as well. And we've defended his appearance in Coutts too. I think that the entire police and legal establishment tried to come down on the truckers like a ton of bricks. And they succeeded in many cases. And maybe they succeeded in breaking the spirit of Chris Lysak and Jerry Morin after 2 years in solitary, or 2 years in maximum security prison. And in Morin's case, I think 74 days in solitary. Maybe they simply broke these men. I remember when I visited Tommy Robinson after he did something like 40 days in solitary confinement, it was like I had met a tortured man. He was psychologically in shock. I'm sure that weighed on the minds of the two men when they took the plea deal. I don't want them to be freed if they're guilty, and I want them to be freed if they're innocent. That's the whole purpose of the justice system. The allegations against the men were astonishingly grave and serious, which is why the judge in the first instance and thereafter did not grant them bail. I think if those serious and grave allegations turned out to be false, and if the police swore informations to obtain that were false, I think they should be sued in civil court for false prosecution, malicious prosecution, abuse of office, negligent investigation, false imprisonment. Because if it turns out that these four men, including the two who took the deal, were put in prison for political purposes as opposed to legal purposes, then heads should roll. We already saw 2 weeks ago that the Federal Court of Canada ruled that the invocation of martial law under the Emergencies Act was inappropriate, was illegal, unjustified, and unconstitutional. And we've seen the justice minister scurry off into the sunset. Right now, Rebel News is fighting with David Lametti, the former justice minister, to try to preserve his private direct messages on Twitter. He doesn't want that to happen. That tells me that perhaps there are messages touching on legal cases, perhaps even the Coutts 4, that he wants to keep secret. I found this case difficult to cover because, first of all, the lawyers and the men obviously cannot talk on the record, and there's been no trial so far. It's been 2 years of drawn out preliminary hearings. I've attended some of them, but they've not shed any important light on the substantive matters at hand. If the last two men do cut a plea deal, we'll never know all the facts because, well, the matter will be closed and we'll hear perhaps snippets of it, but we'll never have an airing of the facts and a testing of the facts in court. Obviously, I want the men out of jail if they didn't do it. But I also want the disclosure and the testing of the accusations that comes with a hearing. And maybe that's why the remaining two men have not pled guilty too. Maybe they say we can actually beat this rap, and it's important that we do. Again, I have no idea because, as you could see, the two lawyers were very brief in their comments today, the two lawyers that were there.